On the Catholic Toolbox, The Art of Practical Catholicism. I'm your host and founder, George Manasseh, here as we equip you with practical tools to live your faith in our modern world of today. And this week, my guest is Father Peter Williams. Welcome back to the show, Father.
Thank you, George. Pleasure to be back.
It's always great to have you, and
Thank you.
And picking your brain and a lot of the knowledge regarding the liturgy. Yeah. So what's our topic today?
Well, the topic today is it's got various titles, sometimes referred to as the Divine Office, sometimes referred to as daily prayer, sometimes referred to as the Breviary, sometimes referred to as the Liturgy of the Hours. So it's had various titles, and in order to understand this, we've actually got to go back right to the beginning again and explore how this pattern of prayer developed. Now, most people would understand that there are two forms of prayer. There is what we call liturgical prayer, or the public worship of the church. So we think about going to Mass, which is obviously a public liturgy, or we go to the celebration of a baptism, or we go to a wedding, or we go to a funeral. They're all public prayer. And in the private prayer realm, as you know, people have their own individual, personal, private prayer. Sometimes they might be built around devotions, like the Rosary or the Stations of the Cross or some other form of prayer. And then we have what we call the public prayer, that is non-sacramental.
Okay.
And that is what we're talking about here. So we're talking about how did it come about that Christians began to pray particular forms of prayer at particular points in the day.
Okay. That are not sacraments.
They're not. That's not.
Because we think of sacraments as always the public prayer of the church.
Well, no, we do when we talk about baptism, or we talk about confirmation, or we talk about sacrament of penance is in fact public, even though it is private in that a penitent goes obviously to a confessor in it, but it is in fact, it's a public prayer. It is part of the official liturgy of the church. But this form of prayer is quite different. So we have to go right back, and we have to go to the time of the early church.
Yep.
And as with so much of our heritage, the practice of praying in the morning and at midday and in the evening, of course, came from the Jewish religion. So that was the practice of a good law-abiding Jew. Would pray in the morning, would pray in the middle of the day, and would pray in the evening. And early Christian communities, particularly obviously those that started in the Holy Land, who were ostensibly Jewish converts, followed that same pattern. And as the church grew, that pattern was extended.
Yeah.
And then, happily for us, we have some writings that date from the 4th century. There was, I suppose we would call her now a member of the Order of Virgins in the church. She lived in a women's community somewhere in Iberia, in Spain.
Yeah.
And she went on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. And her name was Egeria.
Yeah.
And happily for us, Egeria wrote her travels so that she could share it with her fellow sisters back home. And so she ultimately ended up going to the Holy Land and to Jerusalem. And this at the time, of course, when Christianity was the dominant force in the Holy Land. And she records for us her experience of going to the liturgies in Jerusalem.
Yep.
And one of the things she does is she gives very detailed description about their practice of morning prayer and evening prayer.
Wow.
And morning prayer began before dawn, and the people would gather in what we now refer to as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. And they would start chanting psalms. And then ultimately the clergy would join, including the bishop.
Yep.
And then there were certain set psalms that were then, and they never varied. They were the same psalms in the morning and the same psalms in the evening, so everybody knew them off by heart.
Yeah.
And people would pray the psalms together. The psalms would be chanted together. And then at the end, there'd be a prayer, and then every person would come and receive a blessing from the bishop as he sat in his chair, and then they'd obviously go off to work. And in the evening, the same pattern developed. Now, scholars, liturgical scholars, refer to that form of prayer as the cathedral office. They just give it that title.
Cathedral office.
Cathedral office. And what it meant was set psalms, everybody knew, a litany or a set of intercessions, and a final prayer and blessing by the bishop. And then everybody went. And in the evening, they'd all gather back again, and they'd do the evening prayer, I guess we might say, of the church.
Yeah. And this was not the breaking of the bread. This was not the Mass.
No,
this was some other prayer.
Mass. This is the beginnings of what we refer to now as the Liturgy of the Hours.
Yes.
So morning and evening. Okay, so there was that pattern, and the people gathered for it. So it wasn't a professional thing that was done by the clergy. Everybody participated in morning and evening prayer. This, George, predates daily Mass. So daily Mass didn't really become a major feature of the Latin Rite Church until round about the 8th or 9th century.
Yeah.
So the Eucharist was only celebrated on a Sunday, but on the other days of the week, if you wanted to participate in public worship, you participated in morning prayer and evening prayer.
Yeah, I think that's something to remember, that, you know, daily Mass was not something that we had until the 8th century.
No, it didn't happen until the
just
Middle
on
Ages.
Sundays.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, speaking to some Orthodox friends of mine, is that they many of them still don't have the concept of daily
correct.
Mass.
No, they don't.
Yeah.
No, they followed that earlier tradition. And there's a reason why daily Mass became frequent in the Latin Church.
Why is that?
Because when in the monasteries, all ordained monks who were priests had a requirement to offer the Mass every day.
Okay, all right.
So it was part of it came out of monasticism, is that the practice of a daily Mass came out of monasticism.
Pastorally, if you think about it, you don't have any daily Masses. It's a big pastoral load that's taken off the shoulders of a priest.
Well,
if you think about it.
Except that our Orthodox priests, of course, are all bound to are bound also, because they have the Liturgy of the Hours as well.
Okay.
So they would still be going and celebrating daily prayer in their churches. They just wouldn't have a Mass or a Eucharist to follow it. So anyway, that pattern existed for a number of centuries until we begin to see the emergence of monasticism. And then the monastics, particularly those who followed the rule of Benedict, so here, you know, we're talking 5th, 6th century.
5th, 6th, okay, yeah.
Benedict wrote a rule, and one of the in his rule, it was that the members of the community who followed his rule of life would gather several times a day in church for public prayer. And that was developed what we called the monastic office.
Okay.
Now, the monastic office was very different from that earlier form that I was talking to you about.
That was the officium monasticum.
Well, yes.
Liturgical monasticum, yeah.
So what Benedict said was that the staple for all, both in the cathedral office but also in the monastic office, the staple is the recitation of the Psalter, of the 150 psalms. Now, in the cathedral office, as I was saying earlier, the psalms were set every day. So you'd have 4 or 5 psalms that were chosen for the morning and 4 or 5 psalms that were chosen for the evening, and they never varied. But Benedict wanted his monks, members of his who followed his rule, to have access to the entire Psalter.
Yep.
So how was that going to be done? Well, the way that he worked it out was that the psalms, all 150 of them, would be split up amongst various points in the day.
Yep.
And over a period of a week, you would then celebrate the whole 150 psalms. You'd pray the whole 150 psalms, and then you'd start the cycle all over again.
Wow. Okay.
Now,
so you were going through the psalms pretty frequently.
Yeah. And so much so that monks learnt the Psalter off by heart.
Yeah.
When you were repeating the psalms day in, day out, they learnt the psalms. They didn't need to look at parchment.
Yeah.
They didn't need to look. They knew their psalms.
Yeah. I think the brother of Pope Benedict the 16th, Georg Ratzinger, when he was almost partially blind, would still recite the old office off by heart.
Yeah.
Interesting fact.
But so how did they? So the thing about the form of the office was that the monastic office initially didn't require the presence of an ordained cleric.
Okay.
Now, the cathedral office, remember, had the bishop in Jerusalem and the clergy in Jerusalem were involved along with the ordinary people.
Yep.
This form of the office, the monastic office, belonged to the monastic community.
Yep.
And so by the time the rule of Benedict was fully developed, and Benedictinism was the principal form of monasticism in Europe during the Middle Ages by far, they had developed various points of the day when they would, the bell would ring and they would gather in the church and they would recite what we call the hour or the particular hour.
Yeah.
Now, for most Benedictine communities, that began very early in the morning. Some Benedictine communities began at 2 a.m. in the morning.
3 a.m.
Or 2 or 3 o'clock, depending. The bell would ring and they'd all have to get up. It must have been quite a trial in European winters with no central heating. And they'd come into the church and they would pray the office of matins. Sometimes that office had another name. It was sometimes referred to as vigils, but the same office, matins or vigils, was the first office of the day, and it was chanted during the night.
Yes, that's right.
The second office of the day was Lauds, which is we would refer to as morning prayer, and that would be celebrated somewhere around about dawn.
Okay.
Then there'd be another office a few hours later, and that office was called terce, probably round about 9 o'clock in the morning.
Okay, so mid-morning.
Sort of mid-morning. Yeah. And then the midday office was called sext, obviously terce, sext, from the Latin.
Yeah.
And in the afternoon, there was a mid-office afternoon called none.
Yep.
And then another office at sunset called vespers or evening prayer.
Yeah.
And then the last office of the night, which would have been probably chanted around about 8 o'clock, at night was Compline.
Okay.
And then, of course, they'd all go to bed because they needed to, because they had to get up to do it all over again the next morning at 2:00. Now, what shape did that monastic office take? Well, they varied the psalms, so they had a cycle where they would chant all 150 psalms over the course of either a week or 2 weeks.
Okay, so it was 1 or 2 weeks.
Yeah, either 1 or 2 weeks.
Okay. They didn't have year A, B, and C.
No,
not
at all. So the office would begin. With a set of opening versicles. O God, come to our aid. O Lord, make haste to help us. Glory be to the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
And then there would be a hymn, what was referred to as the office hymn. And there are beautiful examples still today of hymns that have been around for centuries and centuries and centuries that are still part of the office.
Yeah.
And then the psalms would follow. And at the conclusion of the chanting of the psalms, there would be a very short biblical reading.
Yep.
Very short, only a matter of a couple of verses.
Okay, yes.
And a responsory, what was called a responsory to those verses, which would pick up what was in those couple of scriptural texts.
Yeah.
And then the singing of, in morning and evening prayer, they would then sing a canticle. In the morning it would be the Benedictus or the Song of Zechariah, and in the evening it would be the Magnificat or the Song of Mary.
Yeah.
So those two biblical canticles would be sung.
Yeah.
And the other canticle that was sung was the Song of Simeon or the Nunc Dimittis at Compline. So the three biblical canticles were associated with morning prayer or Lauds, Vespers, evening prayer, and Compline.
Okay.
The lesser hours, like matins and terce and sext and none, didn't have they didn't have a canticle with them, so they were shorter. And the reason why they were shorter was because in those monastic communities, more often than not, most of the monks would be engaged in some form of work.
They'd be working, yeah.
So they would come in from the fields, or they'd come in from whatever they were doing in the monastery, and go to the church and then go back to work again, which is how it worked.
It's very interesting how this developed. You speak about this very much in a way that it's been influenced by the lived experience of the monastics and those within the life of the church from the sepulchre, and those monastics in monasteries in Europe. Did this organically develop, or did the church codify this in the early church somehow, or set the standard, or did it?
It's an organic development. It was an organic development, and we do have evidence that there were still groups of clergy in some parts of Europe who still came together for the morning and the evening prayer in the church. They were not monastics. They were secular clergy, but who still gathered for morning and evening prayer. Now, by the time we get to the late Middle Ages, on the cusp of the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of what we call the Renaissance period, and the emergence of what we call the mendicant orders, I'm talking about the Dominicans and the Franciscans, because they were, we would say, peripatetic in that they went around, they didn't live in stable communities like monks. They engaged in their mission by going out, as we know. So the friars went out all over Europe. They had a need to be able to pray, but obviously it was necessary that they had some sort of form of a book that they could take with them when they were engaged in their travels and their mission work and their preaching and so on. And that was when that was when the Franciscans invented what we would now call the Breviary.
Yeah.
That is a book that contained the necessary prayers that enabled them to be able to carry a book with them and to be able to recite the hours whilst they were on the move.
Okay. Because it seems, if you think about it from an organic perspective, if you're not going to have the Mass, it seems logical that you would come together and pray in a way that you would read the Psalms, read the Old Testament.
Yeah.
You'd have an opening prayer. You'd sing a hymn together. Then you would proceed to read a passage of Scripture, have a responsorial psalm, a canticle, a closing prayer. It seems quite natural and organic in its development through the lived experience of the church.
Happened. And of course, some communities, because they were basically, interpreted aspects of the rule differently to other Benedictine communities. But ostensibly, by the late Middle Ages, the monastic office was very familiar as a construct all over Europe.
Okay.
And the mendicant friars, the Dominicans and the Franciscans, in some way wanted to follow that pattern.
Yeah.
But naturally, they had to reduce it down. And then, of course, the secular clergy, those who weren't monks or friars, also needed a form of prayer where they could pray.
Yeah.
And so we see the emergence of what we refer to as the Breviary, or what was referred to as the Breviary, which contained the offices that a priest was bound to pray every day. But often they would do it in isolation. They would be by themselves, but they would necessarily recite the prayer of the church. They had an obligation to do that, as indeed every ordained priest and deacon in the church today has an obligation, makes a promise at their ordination, that they will pray the prayer of the church. They'll pray the Liturgy of the Hours.
They don't have an obligation to say Mass every day.
It is encouraged that priests should offer Mass every day, but they have an obligation to pray the Divine Office every day.
Wow, so there seems to be more of an obligation to pray the prayer of the church.
Yeah.
And not as much of an obligation to say the Mass.
Yeah.
These prayers seem to be important.
They are very important.
As the official prayers of the church.
They are very important.
Yeah.
So the what happened, of course, was that after the Protestant Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, obviously during the time of Pope Pius V, when all the liturgical books were renewed, the Breviary was also renewed at that time too.
Exactly.
But the obligation was that priests would pray their office. Now, the problem was that the form...
There's always a problem.
There's always a problem. The problem was that the form that the office took in the Breviary basically aped or followed the monastic office. So, in other words, a priest would be bound to pray all those offices.
A secular priest.
Yes, would be bound to pray the monastic offices in the same way that those who were in monasteries were bound to pray. And over time, what happened was, of course, that that priests would say, well, I have an obligation, I'm bound to pray the office.
Yeah.
So it got to the absurd situation in the last century, and some old priests told me this, that they'd get up very early in the morning and they'd go out into their garden and they would pray the Breviary, but they'd say all the offices in one hit.
Oh.
In other words, they'd be praying Compline before they'd had their breakfast, because they had an obligation to pray the office.
And they didn't have time during their day
and they didn't
ministry.
have time, given the pastoral needs,
as a secular
to be able
cleric.
to stop and rush off to the church and pray the prayer. So in order to say, well, I've fulfilled my obligation by praying that, they would just recite the entire breviary in one shot before breakfast.
Defeats the purpose of sanctifying the hours.
Exactly. So when the revision of the Liturgy of the Hours occurred as a result of the Second Vatican Council, what the revision of the office then said was the two hinges of the day. That was the word that's used in the introduction to the Liturgy of the Hours, is that morning and evening prayer are the hinges of the day. And so what they did was they reduced the office down to 4.
Okay.
So the office of matins, the early one at 2 o'clock in the morning, they renamed that the office of readings.
Okay.
And when you pray the office of readings, you have psalms, but you also have a scriptural reading and you have a reading from the fathers.
Okay.
Lord's is the same shape as the monastic office. And then you've got an option during the day. They give you either prayer in the morning, prayer at midday, or prayer in the afternoon. You don't have to do all 3, but you choose to do one.
Okay.
So you could do prayer in the morning, the old terce, or you could do prayer at midday, the old sext, or prayer in the afternoon, none. But Vespers and Lords,
morning and evening prayer,
are absolutely essential.
Yeah.
And so
that's a bit more practical.
Yeah. So most
secular clergy,
most priests would pray the office of readings, or the old matins, and Lords, and Vespers, and Compline, the last office of the day, or prayer during the night, as it's called.
Yep.
And one of those little ones. So, in other words, it becomes 4, and it becomes a lot more manageable. And in some places, to their credit, some priests advertise that, for instance, they're going to pray morning prayer before the morning mass in their parishes. And that's not uncommon in many places. At the cathedral in Parramatta every morning, there is a group of people who pray morning prayer before the 6:30 a.m. mass. Yeah.
And that's actually how, as a high school student, after my reversion to the faith in Year 9 in 2009, I actually discovered the Liturgy of the Hours because I'd go early to Mass before, and somebody gave me a breviary because you could borrow it. They had it in the library, and then I discovered what it was, and then and it was very interesting. It really took me by surprise to have this well-structured prayer in the morning and in the afternoon. So I bought my own breviary.
Excellent.
From there,
you see, it's not the prayer of monastics. It's not the prayer of clergy. It's the prayer of the church. So it belongs to the whole church. And one of the interesting phenomena in the last 20 or 30 years is that there are a significant number of lay people who are now praying the Liturgy of the Hours, who have taken it upon themselves to join in the public prayer of the church. Because even if they're reciting the office by themselves, they're not by themselves, because they're joined to the rest of the church
at this particular time
in the offering of what we refer to as the sacrifice of praise.
Exactly. And I want you to mention the very important point and speak about this, that the Second Vatican Council beautifully emphasized that the laity, encouraged the laity to participate in the Liturgy of the Hours of the Divine Office.
Yeah, absolutely. And now,
unlike no other council before.
No, and which had been the early practice, as I alluded to,
of the early
church.
So
in the 4th century in Jerusalem, people were coming to morning and evening prayer.
Yep.
And we do have evidence in history that in some places in Europe, some communities still continue to go to the church morning and evening
Yep.
with their clergy. But because of the omnipotence, if you like, of monasticism, the whole monastic practice sort of superimposed on everybody else. And a lot of people thought, oh, well, the practice of praying the office belongs to monastics. That's their thing. That's what they do.
Okay.
Where in fact, it should be what everybody does. And happily now, as you'd be aware, through the wonders of modern technology, for instance, there are apps online where you can download an app which has the Divine Office on it.
A big shout out to one particular app in particular, which is called Laudate.
Right, that's one.
Yeah.
And the one that I use is one called Universalis, which comes out of England.
Yep.
And then in the United States of America, there's even a more briefer form, which you probably would have heard of, called Magnificat.
Yep.
The Magnificat they publish books. They probably do it online these days, to say publishing books, little books, to encourage people to enter into the daily prayer of the church.
Yep.
So with apps like Laudate and Universalis, for instance, it means that anybody now can access the office.
Yeah.
And you can do it on your phone or on your tablet or some other device, and you can join in the prayer of the church. Or if you want to, you can purchase the volumes of the Liturgy of the Hours.
3 volumes, yes.
4
in America.
4 in America. I have both, actually.
I accidentally bought the 4 from America because it was cheaper.
I have the 4. I have both the 4 volume and the 3 volume.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, I need to say the Liturgy of the Hours is currently undergoing a revision. It'll probably take some years before we get a new form of it, but we will get a new form of it eventually. And that will, I think, be a good thing, because I think there are some things that they can probably, improve. But in the meantime, I know a lot of people, a lot of lay people who pray the Liturgy of the Hours. And it's very commendable, because it is the public prayer of the church.
Exactly.
And when you're praying that prayer, even if you're sitting by yourself in your living room in the early hours of the morning, you are praying with the whole church, because the whole church is praying with you, and you're all praying the same thing.
Excellent. I just want to look to the East as well, because I know we're speaking about it in a Latin context, but there are many, all churches, all rites of the church pray the Liturgy of the Hours. And they all have their own different variations, cycle of readings. But the concept is there.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's been there from the early church.
It's been there from the beginning, and it was because those first Jewish converts to Christianity said we must continue the pattern of praying at morning and in the middle of the day and at evening.
Yeah.
And it's just carried through, and it's found different expressions over history, over a couple of thousand years.
So if we look at the early church, those in possibly in Antioch and Syria may have chanted the office or prayed the office in Aramaic, in their native language, or Greek, or Latin, or Coptic in Egypt, in Alexandria, Ethiopian in Ethiopia.
Yeah, absolutely.
And is still going today with all the different rites of the church.
Yep.
And so whatever rite of the church you belong to, all of them have the Liturgy of the Hours.
They do.
Or they call it the liturgy, the prayer of the church, Liturgy of the Hours.
Or Divine Office.
Divine Office. Or morning, evening prayer.
Yeah.
It's
all the same thing.
And I was actually speaking to a Jewish friend of mine, and they have something similar. I mean, because it does have Jewish roots.
Yeah. Well, it follows that pattern.
They pray something similar with the Psalms.
Yes,
the Old Testament,
well, remember,
in the morning and the evening.
Psalms, but the way that we reflect on the Psalms is different.
Yeah.
Because right from the beginning, the early the first desert fathers, when
Yeah.
you think about people like St. Anthony of Egypt,
Yeah.
the hermits who predate
Western
Benedict.
monasticism.
Yeah, my word, they do.
This is where monasticism came from.
What they did was that they spent their whole days reciting psalms.
Yeah.
But they did it with what we would say is a Christological lens. In other words, they saw in the expression of the psalms, the texts of the psalms, they saw it as the voice of Christ.
Yep.
So they gave all the psalms what we would say a Christological reading. They saw it as an expression of the mind of Christ.
Wow.
And that's why if you look at even the Liturgy of the Hours today as it's printed, you will see before the psalms, they've got antiphons, but before that you'll see a little subtext, which will often be a quote from Scripture, from the New Testament, that is meant to help someone see it through the eyes of Christ.
Yeah.
So that still carries on even to today. And the Psalms, as you know, are, some of the Psalms are, when you read them, some of the Psalms are quite violent in their intent.
Yeah.
Some of them
that is true.
what we call the deprecatory Psalms.
Yeah, exactly.
And in the revision of the Psalter, as resulted from the Second Vatican Council, they were all chopped out. Now, I actually don't think they should have been chopped out. And if I were revising the Liturgy of the Hours, I'd probably put some of those Psalms back in. Because I don't think that we should run away from some of the harder or more anguished expression of the voice of the psalmist over history, over Jewish history.
Yeah.
For instance, one of my great regrets is that the very lovely psalm from memory 142, by the waters of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered you, O Zion. So it's a song of anguish and lament from the Jewish community who were in exile in Babylon. And the last verse of that psalm, is full of rage and anger about what's happened to them. And it says, and may referring to their captives, may the heads of your children be smashed against the stones. And I remember as a boy that, we would, when I was a choir boy, we would sing that psalm, and then immediately you go on to, glory be to the Father and to the Son. And for a while, a lot of people felt, but it actually expresses the whole human mood, and not that anybody is advocating that children's heads should be smashed against stones.
Yeah.
But what it does do is it's an honest expression of the depths and the anguish and the anger
of the human mind,
and what human beings are capable of doing. It's not encouraging that, but it's just saying that is how people are. And yet we can stand before God, who is all gracious and all merciful, and express the limitations of our humanity and its weaknesses, and its excesses. And the Psalms give expression to all of that. And so I'm a great fan of not censoring the Psalter, which the reformers of the Liturgy of the Hours did. I wouldn't do it.
Okay. Hopefully we could bring them back.
I'd like to bring them back, because I just think that's being honest. I think you don't just chop out those parts that appear to you to be unpalatable. Exactly. I think we're big enough and brave enough to be able to accept that we're not saying that you should think this way now, but it is what human beings are capable of. And it did enter into the minds of those who wrote the
Literally
psalm.
or figuratively.
Yeah.
In
So
allegorical sense.
why run away from it?
Yeah.
So I don't think we should do that.
When I turned 21, a friend of mine actually, who's a Syriac Catholic, belongs to the Syrian Catholic Church, gifted me a monastic office, which was fairly large. It was an A5 size in Aramaic. It was all in Aramaic.
Yeah.
Just to remind me of my heritage.
Of your heritage, yeah.
Of my ancestral heritage.
Yeah. Well, of course...
And discourage my
well, the
Latin
Eastern,
upbringing.
as you were quite right, Eastern rites also have the office.
Yeah.
So, the Maronite Church has its office. The Melkites have their office.
Yeah.
The
Coptics.
Ukrainian Catholics have their office. Everybody's got their form of morning and evening prayer.
Yeah.
But I think the important thing is that it is, as much as our own personal individual prayer is important to us in terms of our own growth and our own devotional life, and I'm not suggesting for a minute that doesn't have significance, or it has huge significance for each and every one of us. But the beauty of the divine office, or the Liturgy of the Hours, is that you are praying the same prayer that the whole church is praying.
Exactly, at the same time.
It unifies you with all those other voices that are lifting up in the praise and worship of God on a daily basis.
Beautiful.
And I think that's what commends it the most.
Beautiful. Let's now go into 3 practical tools.
3 practical tools.
Very important here on the Catholic Toolbox.
Yes,
we can't live without the practical tools.
Okay.
We spoke about the beautiful Liturgy of the Hours, the history. Right. What can we do with this in 2025?
What we can do is that if you're serious about wanting to participate in the public prayer of the church, download one of the apps that we were talking about.
Universalis.
Or Laudate.
Laudate.
Or even have a look at Magnificat's offerings online.
Magnificat, yeah. And a few of them are free, actually. I think 2 of them are free.
So, and then I would suggest just start with morning and evening prayer, the 2 hinges of the day.
Yep.
Just read morning and evening prayer. Don't try and take on the whole menu.
Yeah.
Take on morning and evening prayer. As the Constitution says, they're the hinges of the day.
Okay.
That would be the second thing that I would do. And the third practical thing is this. If your life is so overwhelmingly busy that you can't manage morning and evening prayer at the appropriate times of day because you've got so many responsibilities, it might well be that you're married and you've got children, and children's needs, come whenever they come. At least try to do the last office of the day, which is prayer at the end of the day, or compline, because that can be prayed when you're sitting up in bed before you go to sleep.
Yep.
So those would be the things that I'd encourage your audience to do. Download an app, try morning and evening prayer, and if you can't manage that because your life is just so super busy, at least commit yourself to doing compline or prayer at the end of the day.
And it's quite short.
And it's very short.
Very
it's
short.
5 minutes.
Yeah.
5 minutes.
It's 5 minutes, and the rest, morning prayer Lords, if you were to pray it, is that about 10 minutes?
Yeah, it's about 10 minutes.
10 minutes.
Yeah.
And then
so
evening prayer is 10 minutes.
Evening prayer is 10 minutes, yeah.
Okay, and then if you really can't do it, then 5 minutes at the end of the night.
5 minutes at the end of the day. And know that you're joining with the voices of countless hundreds of thousands of other people throughout the world.
At the same time. There's something about it where everyone's doing it at the same time.
Yeah. So I think there's a beauty in all of that, and it helps connect us into the church itself.
Yeah, and that's what really attracted me when I found out about the Divine Office, Liturgy of the Hours, when I was in high school. And the fact that you're participating with everybody at the same time.
Yeah.
And other religions have this concept.
They do.
Muslim brothers, they all pray at the same time.
Yeah.
The Jews have this concept.
Yeah.
You know, and I think sometimes we can feel as Catholics that element is missing.
Yeah.
You know,
but it
that universal...
doesn't need to miss, because it's available to you. It's as accessible as your phone.
I think because people just think the different masses are at different times, but this is something which is prayed at the same sort of time period, you know,
and
for
you
everybody.
and you lead yourself.
Yeah.
So it doesn't require, clerical leadership.
But you know what's quite nice for people to learn how to get into it is do it in a community. You know, Parramatta Cathedral has it at 6:30 a.m. Yeah. I actually used to join some friends of mine, Franciscan friends of mine in Dundas, who used to chant it in the morning. So I learned how to chant the office.
And some places, and one of the initiatives that also people can do is that if you get a group of people together, then go to the parish priest and say, Father, I've got a group of people together. Would we be able to say, evening prayer at 5:30 every night in the church?
Or a Friday at least. Or chant it if you have a good enough choir.
But what I'm saying is, it doesn't require a priest or a deacon to be there. This is something that lay people can lead themselves.
Exactly.
It doesn't require that. At the Cathedral at Parramatta, morning prayer is led by a layperson.
What's nice at Sydney Cathedral, and you can watch this live on the YouTube channel, and I actually on Sunday evenings we play it. Is it's chanted?
Yes. Well, they sing Vespers now
beautifully.
It's a lovely thing a tradition that started under the previous director of music, Thomas Wilson.
Yeah.
And that the current Daniel Justin, the current director of music, is continued. Is that each day they sing Vespers in the chapel. It's beautiful. I've been myself when I've been in the city. I've rushed to the cathedral in the afternoon because I know Vespers will be on.
Yeah, well, you can watch it live.
It's wonderful that I know they do that. So there's that opportunity to join in its sung form.
Yeah. So. Whichever form works for you. But thank you so much, Father.
That's all right.
It's been a beautiful discussion, and it's a topic which a lot of people, it's new to a lot of people. Yeah. It really is, and I hope we've shed some light here tonight on the Divine Office.
One final point.
Yes.
This also would be a very good discipline given the fact that Lent's not all that far away.
Yes, in a few more weeks.
So if people are looking for an extra challenge for Lent, which begins on, I think, the 5th of March is Ash Wednesday, then take the office up.
Yes, absolutely. We don't realise that Lent is around the corner, so I think we better get ready. Eh, John? Yeah, Lent's around the corner.
Lent's around.
Ash Monday or Ash Wednesday?
Thank you.
We can go with both, Ash Wednesday or Ash Monday. Excellent. Thank you for tuning into the show. Don't forget to subscribe to our weekly podcast. So go to thecatholictoolboxshow.com. That is thecatholictoolboxshow.com. Thank you for tuning into the show. I'm your host and founder, George Manasseh. Until next week, God bless, take care, and take action. In this era of grave spiritual crisis, it is not enough to simply know about your Catholic faith. That is why we need a Catholic toolbox to equip us with the practical skills necessary to live our Catholic faith to reach our ultimate goal, which is heaven for all eternity. Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. Join us every Tuesday night at 8 p.m. for the Catholic Toolbox as we hand you the tools to go forth, live the faith, and change our modern world today. Live on the Voice of Charity.